behavior haven't changed. Given the profit motive and the particular geographical and social environment of the Indian subcontinent, these ideas evolved because they suited our ancestors. Similar forces also drive modern globalization. Human behavior, the profit motive, and particular geographical, technological, and political configurations, allowing its ideas and institutions to evolve and thrive. So it shouldn't really be that surprising that ancient societies, though they didn't have gigantic freighter ships, internet connections, and passports, also had some form of globalization, rudimentary and different from ours though it was. India was especially well positioned for that sort of thing compared to many ancient societies. It was bang in the middle of the Indian Ocean, about midway between the massive markets of the Mediterranean and China. So let's come back to our ivory carving. How did this beautiful Indian lady come to ancient Rome? The answer, like much in history, is we don't know for sure, not 100%. We know that at least since the times of Cyrus of Persia in the 7th century BCE, there was already some contact between West Asia and India. And then, after the disruptive campaigns of Alexander the Great in the 4th century BCE, which we started this season with, the Greco-Roman world began to rapidly emerge as a new power center. These new elites in this new power center now knew about India. And as we saw in episode 1 of this podcast, they were connected to India through political links. And so, trade began to bloom, flowing from India through Persia into the Mediterranean. But then the Central Asian and Parthian tribes came in, as we saw in episode 2, bringing with them turmoil and warfare and creating new trade networks in India's northwest. Trade from Gandhara was temporarily less viable for the Mediterranean, but that was for the best, it turned out, because now Central and West India along the Deccan coast also entered the trade game. The Romans were busy brutally conquering most of the Mediterranean world and extracting wealth, which ended up in the hands of new elites in new urban centers, connected through the turbulent maritime highway of the Mediterranean Sea. And in India, we saw in episode 3 that state formation was also well underway. Don't worry, I'll put links to all these episodes in the description. In India, as in ancient Rome, there was increased social stratification, urbanization, and economic specialization, allowing for the exchange and development of goods and ideas. Much of the maritime trade from the Mediterranean to India was controlled by a kingdom founded by one of the successors of Alexander, a man called Ptolemy. This kingdom was Egypt, and Ashoka Maurya actually sent diplomats to interact with a descendant of Ptolemy, calling him Ptolemaia in his inscriptions. The Ptolemies, like the Indo-Greeks or really the Indo-everythings, settled down into Egypt, blending with their culture. But since they were much closer to the Greek world, they retained much Greek influence, whereas the Indo-Scythians, or the Indo-Greeks, weren't really close to their homelands and so became much more Indianized. This Greek kingdom in Egypt had two shores. One was on the Mediterranean Sea, opening onto the Greco-Roman world. The other was on the Red Sea, pouring into the Arabian Sea and connected from there to India. Explorers discovered the monsoon winds that blew ships to India roughly in the 1st century BCE. They would have come to Gujarat, to Maharashtra, all along the western coast of the great peninsula of South India. Soon they came to the east coast as well, which we'll discuss in a later episode. But on the western coast of India, they would have met newly emerging states with their own artistic traditions, such as the Satavahanas and the Shakas. Greco-Egyptian buyers would have picked up stuff that they thought was appealing and sold to Indians the stuff that Indians found appealing. There would have been an exchange of ideas and of artistic traditions. Indian artisans, who were always an inventive sort of bunch, experimented with styles that their new patrons would have liked. Indian elites would have wanted the exotic styles of the West, and the West, even in this early period, wanted the exotic magical goods of India. We'll talk more about how Roman art influenced Indian masters in the next episode of the podcast, but it's a remarkable parallel to how Indian elites today continue to consume and adapt Western styles in produce. One would have thought, really, that having these close trading ties would have helped ancient Indians and Romans realize that they weren't so different after all. But strangely enough, ideas are heavier than luxury items. Romans received goods that Indians would have found completely normal, such as spices. But since these goods were rare and came from far away, the Romans didn't know their original mundane purpose. Writing from the time shows that stuff like spices, perfumes, and Indian art were actually believed to be magical objects. And what's really interesting is that there's a similar pattern in how the West sees India today. We are still exotic, still alien, still somehow different. Have you ever met an Indian hippie wandering around the beaches of Marseille, France, searching for spiritual enlightenment in the works of Plato, or for that matter, the doctrines of the medieval Catholic Church? On the other hand, the beaches of Pondicherry are thickly covered with Western tourists on a mission to discover themselves by studying medieval or even early modern Indian philosophy that most Indians would never even have heard about. I'm always tempted to tell them, look, you can come to Pondicherry for the pretty beaches and the colonial history, but your whole millennial discovering yourself by backpacking through India is just some Orientalist hokum that has been nicely marketed to you, and the only enlightenment you're going to find is going to be a very, very expensive placebo effect. The strange thing is that even Indians have internalized this Western view of Indian culture, seeing it as some sort of source of perfect wisdom and magical spirituality. And I get that. It's hard to admit that our ancestors, brilliant as they were just as flawed and brilliant as any other ancient humans. It's hard to say, hey, you know what, we were special, but only as special as every other human civilization. And it's even harder to say that because it means that we can't easily say that our ancestors weren't any more special or advanced than the Western colonizers who made us ashamed of our culture for so long. But that's a debate for another day and another place. So let's come back to the 2nd century BCE and continue with the tale of early globalization. The exchange of artistic traditions, driven by the need to appeal to new, sort of proto-globalized cosmopolitan elites, explains a great deal about the mysterious ivory lady of Pompeii. Any modern Indian would take a look at her and say, bro, that's one of us. I'll put a bunch of pictures of her in the description and you can tweet me if you agree. But the Yakshi is also different. There are echoes of Indian art in her, but there's clearly some influence from Greco-Roman ideas of art as well. If you've been to the Sanchi Stupa in central India, you can also see some similarities in the way she's carved. Now the thing is, like most Indian sacred sites, Sanchi was worshipped at for centuries and was constantly updated with donations from patrons using the latest artistic styles. Bands of master artisans would have traveled from one part of the subcontinent to another, wherever there was a demand for their work, and spread styles across regions across centuries. So maybe some of them were involved in making her. I know I haven't really answered the question about where the Yakshi has come from, but there's one final clue which I haven't mentioned yet. On the bottom of the statue is a single letter in Kharoshthi script. In episode 2 of the podcast, I mentioned that Kharoshthi was the script used in the northwestern part of the Indian subcontinent, in Gandhara, but Our Lady doesn't look that Gandharan. It's still enough of a clue to reconstruct her story though, and it's even more complex than you may have thought. The Yakshi of Pompeii was probably made in central India for a Gandharan market during the early period of urbanization when the Satavahanas were rising to power. Maybe an artisan whose father worked at Sanchi taught him how to carve, and they were making stuff adapted to the artistic tastes of some wealthy Gandharans. This is why art history can be so fascinating. It shows us the imprints, the traces that our ancestors left on the turbulent, never-ending river of time. Now somehow, despite the turmoil of the times, with Central Asian tribes flowing into the northwest, the carving found her way through trade to Gandhara. There, perhaps, she caught the eye of a Greek